everyone, my name's Kelvin and welcome back to another watercolor tutorial for Procreate. In this video I'm going to paint this sort of simple flower branch with some leaves in the style of I think she's a Ukrainian artist by the name of Vicky Odd. And I think her style is really interesting. It's kind of a hybrid style, and I recommend checking out the link to her Instagram page in the description. And I'm going to start out here with a blank watercolor paper. In this case, it's the St. Petersburg texture, and I'll put a link to everything I use, textures and brushes, in the description down below. So I'm going to start out by just lowering the transparency of this sketch, just so I can barely see it there. Then I'm going to grab a blank layer underneath the watercolor paper texture, and I'm going to grab the abstract round brush. And I'm going to start by painting the flower in the lightest color in the flower. We're going to go from light to dark. So with the abstract round brush, I'm just going to carefully fill in the flower, as best as I can, staying inside the lines of the sketch. After I fill in the flower, I'm going to grab the eraser, and I'm just going to go in there very carefully in a few of the areas where I went way outside of the sketch and just sort of cut it back a little bit. After that, I think I'm going to lighten this a little bit more because it did end up a little bit darker than I intended. I'm also going to shift it a little bit closer to pink because I want these flowers to be sort of pink or peach colored. So we've got the base color laid down, and not every flower will have this, but this one does have some kind of curling edges. So I'm going to start by making the whole flower darker except for these curling edges. And I'm going to do that with the selection tool set to freehand. And I'll just quickly make a selection that just sort of follows inside all those little curling edges. There we go. So I've got a selection. It just sort of goes away from those edges. I'll go to hue, saturation, and brightness. And I'll just darken it just a little bit. And I'll deselect that. Next, I'm going to add a sort of darker center. So I'm going to use the selection tool and just draw a circle in the center. But I'll feather this one out quite a bit. Hue, saturation, and brightness. And I'll darken it just a little bit more, but I want it to be richer, so I'll raise the saturation too. And next, I'm going to add a slightly harder shadow in there. So I'll grab the selection tool again, set to freehand, and just make a random kind of blocky selection just along the inside like this. And I won't feather that. I'll go straight to hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just slightly darken it. And this will give a kind of interesting hard edge that will make the petals here a little more interesting. It'll give them a little bit more texture. Next, I'm going to add some lines here on each of the petals. So I'm going to make a new layer above my flower here. I'm going to select a sort of medium color. It doesn't really matter because we can adjust the opacity on the separate layer. I'll grab the fine liner pen, and at a medium size, I'll just do these lines real quick. And I want them to be a little bit sloppy, so I'm going to do them real fast. And notice how they're sort of curving. The middle ones are pretty straight, but on the outside, they're sort of curving in like that. And I'm going to go to the Layers panel and change that to Multiply. Lower it to 0, and just raise it up just until I can barely see it. And it might help to just switch off the sketch just for a moment. And then adjust this until, there we go, I think that looks pretty good. And I'll turn the sketch back on. And next I'm going to move to the center of the flower here. And I'm going to do that in a sort of medium light yellow. So I'll make a new layer, but just to keep this organized, I'll merge the lines with the flower just to flatten that out. And on this layer above, I'll choose a yellow color. Now it's important, I think, that the yellow color is about as bright as the bright part of the flower. And I'm going to do this with the fine liner pen, but at a much bigger size. And I'll just sort of spiral out until I fill in the center there of the sketch. So we've got the center of the flower here, about at the same level of brightness as the brightest highlight out here. And I'm going to grab the water blender and just blend the edge of this a little bit. There we go, that looks pretty good. And at this point, I don't really need the sketch for now, so I'll just go ahead and turn that off. And now I'll grab the center of this flower here, and I'm going to make a layer above it. Just in case I mess this up, it's going to be easier just to clear the layer than undo it, because I'm going to add a lot of tiny line details, which will be hard to undo. So I'm going to select a pretty dark color, almost black actually, and I'm going to use the fine liner pen, but at a smaller size, and I'm just going to go along the edge and just make all these parallel lines like that, kind of randomly. And then in the middle, I'll do some dotting, and then I'll just add a bunch more tiny lines, just pretty much making the edge a solid band of almost black. And after that, I'm going to do this again in a slightly lighter version of that color, but to kind of a lesser degree, just a few lines and a few dots. And then at the very last step, I'm going to grab almost pure white, and I'm just going to do a few of these. like that, a few dots in the middle, and then a lot of little tiny white dots just along the inside here. And I'm also going to add some white dots onto the actual petals here. There we go, that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to add some sort of lines of contrast onto the flower petals. So I'm just going to merge these together for now, just those dots and then the center of the flower. And I'll just turn that off. And I'm going to go and grab the flower layer, make a layer above it so it's kind of in between the center of the flower and the background. And then on this layer, I'm going to add some sort of contrast lines. So I'm going to select a sort of medium gray color, but sort of reddish, sort of to match the color of the flower. Then I'm going to grab the fine liner pen, and at a pretty small size, and not in every area, but just in a few areas, I'm going to sort of draw on the very edge here, very lightly. And then in some areas, I might press a lot harder and then lighten it off, and then leave it at that, and then do it again in basically any other random area like this. And after I've done that, I'm going to look at the folds. Now, again, not every flower has to have these, but this one does. So where the sort of edge of the petal is curving around, I'm going to very lightly go over the boundary on those as well. So after that first layer, I'm going to go to this layer in the Layers panel, set it to Multiply, set it to 0, and just raise it up until I can barely see it there. So it's about maybe just slightly darker than these lines. And that's the first layer of the outlining. So I'm going to make a new layer and do the second layer. And this is going to be much more sparing, but much darker. So this time I'm going to grab almost pure black, and I'm going to use the fine liner pen at the same size. And just in a few different areas, I'm going to add some harder black edges like that. There we go. So I've just done it in a few places, a lot less than the previous one. And down here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the definition of the petal fading into the center. So what I'm going to do is choose one petal, and I'm going to follow the edge of that one, and then just sort of define the edge off into the center. And it doesn't matter what happens down here because it's going to be covered up when we turn on the center of this flower. There we go, so that's done, and I can turn on the center of the flower to see what it looks like now. And I think that looks pretty good, but I do want to move the center, so I'll select the center layer there and just sort of reposition it a little bit better. So the flower is all done, and I'm really happy with the way this one turned out. So I'll just go ahead and merge all the layers of the flower together, and then in the next part, I'm going to do all the leaves. So let me turn the sketch back on and position this right ways up here. And I'm going to turn off the flower for now, and I'm going to make a separate layer, but I'm going to make sure it's underneath the flower, and I'm going to do all the leaves on this one. But first, I'm going to do like a branch here. So I'll choose a sort of light khaki color. I'll use the fine liner pen, but at a pretty big size, and I'll just sketch out sort of where this branch is. There we go, pretty simple. I think I'll shift the hue a little bit because it ended up too dark. And I'm going to go over it again just to add some sort of interesting variation in the color there, just along kind of the bottom edge. That would get more of the shadow. And after that, I'll make a new layer and start on the leaves. And I'm just going to choose a kind of pastel, almost green color, but I'm going to go a little bit more towards yellow, maybe an olive color. And I'll use the abstract round brush. And these are going to be sort of stroke based. I'm basically just going to go along one side, pressing harder, then lightening off, and then going back on the other side, and then filling it in. And I'm just going to go ahead and do all the leaves this way. But a few times I'm going to change to a darker color so all the leaves aren't exactly the same shade of green. So I've done all the leaves, but I didn't do a lot of detail in here because I know from the sketch that this is going to get covered up. I just did the major points of it. And now I'm going to go in with the eraser and sort of try to refine and define some of the leaves that ended up getting a little bit messed up using this stroke-based technique. So at this point, I think I want to bring in the flower again because it's going to help me manage the contrast here. So I'm going to go and turn the flower on. And right away, you can see we're having some transparency issues. So I'm going to use a trick that I've used before. I'm just going to put this flower on a white background. So what I'm going to do here is I'll make a duplicate of the flower. So I have two copies of it. I'm going to turn off the top one and then select the bottom one. And I'm going to use the hue, saturation, and brightness to turn that whole layer into like a white flower basically. And you can see in the layers panel there, just by raising the brightness, it made it pure white. But we still have transparency. So I'm just going to make copies of this flower just until I can barely see that I'm not able to see what's behind it, like it's getting covered up. So in this case, it took 3 copies. You might need more, but after that, just merge those together. And then you can turn on the original flower, and you can see we don't have contrast anymore because this white layer here, this white version of the flower, is covering up the leaves down here. So I know that's a little bit confusing, but it might be worth watching this part maybe one more time and giving it a try, and I think it'll make sense. So I've got these 2 flowers here. I'm just going to merge them together just to keep it more organized. And now I can zoom out here and sort of look at the whole picture and see if something is going wrong. And it looks all right actually. This shade of green is a little bit darker than the flower, so we still have some nice contrast. And I'll turn off the sketch here. Yeah, so this looks pretty good, but if it doesn't, in your case, this would be a good time to adjust the color of the leaves by selecting the layer with the leaves, going to hue, saturation, and brightness, and just either brightening them or darkening them until they sort of match the scene a little bit better. So now I'm going to go in and just merge the leaves and the branch together onto one layer. And then I'm going to grab the water blender brush. And at a pretty small size, I'm just going to go in there and just blend all this stuff up, all these hard edges that just don't look quite right. There we go. So I've just done some kind of a little bit of creative blending there. I'm trying to imagine what would happen if this was painted all with a wet watercolor where these different shades sort of mixed together. So next I can move on to the line detail on these leaves. So I'll make a new layer above the leaves for that. And I'll choose a, probably the same color is fine actually. And I'm going to use the fine liner pen. And at a pretty small size actually, I'm just going to go in there and add some lines down the center of these leaves. And after that, I'm going to grab this color again, but just choose a slightly lighter version of it. And I'm just going to really quickly and roughly add some of these angled lines like this. There, so I've added all the lines. Now in some areas you can't see the lines at all. And this is why I use the transparency mode of multiply. So if I go to my layers panel, here's the layer where I drew those lines. It's set to normal right now, but watch what happens when I change it to multiply. Now suddenly even the dark leaves show those lines. So that's really the main reason I use multiply a lot. And I'm going to set the opacity to 0 and just slowly raise it back up. So I think that looks pretty good. And I'll deselect here. And now I want to add some sort of interesting variation to the leaves. And the way I do that is I'll make sure I have the leaf layer selected. I'll go to my freehand selection tool, and I'm just going to select basically down 1/2 of the leaf like that. I'll feather it out just a tiny bit and then darken it. And I'm going to do a bunch of shading like this, not necessarily covering only the half. In some cases it might start part way down and then go back, but in every case I'm going to feather it out a little bit and try to end it at the center line. And this is going to give it a pretty convincing watercolor kind of irregularity. Okay, that looks pretty good. And I'm going to go ahead and do this again, but this time I'm going to lighten it and I won't feather it. So I'm just going to randomly select a few areas, sort of ending at the spine there. And then after I've got a few selected, I won't feather it. I'll go to hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just brighten them a tiny bit this time. And then as a final touch for the leaves, I'll make a random freehand selection, just grabbing a few of the random outside edges of those leaves, and I'll feather it out quite a bit. I'll go to hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll try to introduce a little bit of yellow in there and maybe brighten it up just a little bit. If you felt like your leaves needed more definition, you could do the same trick that I did on the flower and add a dark edge, kind of a 2-step dark edge. But in this case, I want the leaves to be sort of in the background, and they don't need to be as well defined as the flower. So there we go. This one is all done. If you like this process, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you have any questions about this, just leave a comment down below, and I'll try to get back to you guys as soon as possible. But other than that, guys, thank you so much for your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.